You're gonna love this. Game theory. So game theory is the study of how people behave in strategic situations. And this word strategy is somewhat of a term here. It means when your outcome depends on your own decisions as well as others. A good way of thinking about it is a game of chess. All right, when you play chess, what you do is not enough, but also what other people do. So there's an interaction between the two people. So you must consider how others will respond and react to your actions. All right. And in a way, all of our behavior is really a form of strategic situation because usually or almost always we are involved with other people and their actions also figure into our results, right? That's why game theory has a lot of applications in everyday life. All right. Now, one cool thing here is this prisoner's dilemma, which is when cooperation is beneficial but it's difficult to maintain. So it's illustrated through this example of two prisoners. So we have two criminals who have been caught with enough evidence to convict them to 1 year in jail, right? So let's say they were caught with, I don't know, with weapons or something like that. But there's also some evidence that they were jointly involved in a bank robbery, but not enough evidence to convict them, right? So we kind of think that they were involved in a bank robbery, but we can't prove it. So we need more information, and in this case, we want to get their confession, whether they were involved or not. So pause here, take some notes before we proceed with this game. The police tells each criminal in a separate room. Separate room means that they don't see each other, they cannot make an agreement with each other, so they're isolated. They're told, right now you have 1 year of jail sentence. Okay, that's proven. Now, if you confess to the joint robbery and the other person remains silent, so they don't confess, then you go free. We're going to let you go free, and the other guy gets 20 years. If he confesses and you remain silent, then he is freed, but you get 20 years. And if both of you confess, then each of you will get 8 years. All right, so this is a situation. This is kind of like a trick by the police to make sure that they do have the incentive to confess. All right, so give me two criminal names. So let's say Snake in The Simpsons, and the other guy. Who is the other evil guy there? Sideshow Bob. Yeah, so let's say these are our two criminals, and each of them has to make a decision. Each of them has to decide either to remain silent or to confess. All right, so we're gonna have a table or a matrix which shows the possible options. So the first option is that both of them remain silent. If both of them remain silent, each of them will get 1 year. Notice here that the color green represents what happens to Snake and the outcome of Snake basically, and color yellow represent what happens to Bob. Now what if Snake confesses but Bob remains silent? So if Snake confesses, what happens is that he goes free, but Bob gets 20 years. All right. If it's the other way around, if Bob confesses and Snake remains silent, then Bob goes free and Snake gets 20 years. And if both of them confess, then each of them will get 8 years. All right. So pause here and draw the table. You don't have to write down all of the information. You could, it doesn't hurt, but make sure you draw the table. And if you can color code it so that you don't mix the two, then go ahead. Otherwise, you can write their names next to the payoffs that they have so that you don't confuse them. So what should they do? What should each of the two criminals in this case do? What is the best option for them? So let's see the line of thinking of any of them. Let's say Snake in this case. Snake is thinking that Bob will either confess or remain silent. Remember, these are in two isolated rooms. They cannot communicate with each other. Okay, so they cannot kind of plan ahead and say, okay, both of them are gonna remain silent so we get the least amount of jail time, right? They're separated. So Snake is trying to think what Bob is gonna do. Now, if Bob remains silent, so Bob remaining silent means that he's choosing the silent option. But then Snake has to choose between either silent or confess. Which one is better for Snake? 1 year or free? Well, obviously free is better for Snake. So in that case, it is in the interest of Snake to confess, assuming that Bob is going to remain silent. Yeah. Now, what if Bob confesses? Now, if Bob confesses, then Snake is again thinking about either silent or confess. So if assuming that Bob is going to confess, then we are talking about either 20 years or 8 years. Which one is better? Relatively speaking, 8 years is less than 20, right? So again, the best option for Snake is to confess, right? Notice this is kind of interesting because whether Bob remains silent or confesses, we don't know what he's going to do. But either way, it's better for Snake to confess. So no matter what Bob does, I'm better off if I confess, right? So that's the optimal option for Snake. And Bob does the same analysis. It's a symmetric game, right? So this is exactly the same line of thought can be discussed with Bob, and what you get is that he's also going to confess, right? So what happens is that both of them are going to confess, and what you end up is that each of them is going to get 8 years. Okay, so they're going to plead guilty basically. Right? Oh no, I did the bank robbery with the other guy, and that's what's going to happen. And basically this is called a dominant strategy. So dominant strategy is one of those terms. It means a decision that is best for a player regardless of the strategies chosen by the other players, right? So either way, this is what we're going to do. And this word regardless is kind of important here. Regardless means that you don't need to know what the other guy is going to do. Okay, so if there is such a case where you would still do the same thing no matter what the other person does, right? So this idea of no matter or regardless is quite important. Then that's called the dominant strategy. Okay, by the way, this word strategy is the same as decision. Okay, they're synonymous. You can use them interchangeably. Now notice which one is best for both of them jointly. If you look at the chart, what you have is that 1 year and 1 year would be optimal. But it's unstable because if you're in the 1 year box, then each of them has an incentive to go free, right? So each of them has an incentive to deviate from that decision. If you look at the 8 year and 8 year, it's not optimal, it's suboptimal, but it's stable. It's stable in the sense that none of them has an incentive to change their mind, okay? So that's what's going to happen. Pause here and take notes. Wow, did you see that? It was crushed. All right, so here we have a concept of Nash equilibrium, and that's when each player chooses their dominant strategy. This is named after John Nash. You might have seen this movie, Beautiful Mind. So that's John Nash. Well, that's Russell Crowe, but playing John Nash. So he was this brilliant mathematician, economist who actually won the Nobel Prize, and he came up with this analysis. So that's called a Nash equilibrium. Equilibrium, remember, the idea of equilibrium is a point of stability, right? So no player has an incentive to change their decision. If that's the situation, we call that a Nash equilibrium. It's not necessarily the highest payoff or outcome. This is kind of important. Nash equilibrium is not the best choice for both of them, but it's the stable choice, okay? So what makes something a Nash equilibrium is that it's stable. And how do you know it's stable? Is that there is no incentive to change their mind, okay? So that's the idea. Now, sometimes you have repeated games, and repeated games would make it more complicated. Repeated games means that you are dealing with one person not only once, but in repeated times, right? So any kind of relationship that you think of, long-term relationships, those are repeated games. Sometimes in a repeated game, you have to kind of let go of a benefit today because you know that later on it's going to pay off. So you have to be a little bit more dynamic with your decisions. You have to be smarter. So one of the things that could happen is retaliation. So you could penalize the other side for lack of cooperation. All right. So if they kind of cheat on you, then later on you can cheat on them, okay, or penalize them in another way. And that's why you have something called the tit for tat strategy. And that's when you cooperate in the first round before having any kind of reputation, and then you do what the other person did last time, right? So if they cooperate with you, then you keep cooperating. As long as they cooperate, you keep cooperating. Whenever they cheat, then the next round you cheat on them, okay? So that would be the idea. This is a lame example of the tit for tat strategy. All right, pause here. They've actually used prisoner's dilemma in Dilbert, so let's watch this.
Tell us what happened and we'll recommend the light sentence.
Nice try. But I happen to understand a little thing called the prisoner's dilemma.
Is that so?
You have no physical evidence of a crime, so you can only convict us if one of us rats out the others. And since we're all aware of that fact, no one will rat out anyone. and we'll be free in a matter of minutes.
It was all Dilbert. I told him not to chop the body up, but he insisted. He said that's how he gets rid of all his victims. Oh, hi, Dilbert.
Alice?
He has always been evil. I felt it. But I never knew how evil until he would not stop plunging that fork into Todd's body. I stopped counting at 100. Oh, God. Hello, Dilbert.
Ashok!
May I have that ice cream sandwich you promised me now?
What a mess. Alright, there is this thing called competition laws. In the US, it's called antitrust, and antitrust, sometimes it's written in one word, and it's a special term. It's basically the idea that we need to promote competition and prevent cooperation. Alright, when we say trust, one of the meanings of trust is merger, when companies merge together. Okay, merging is problematic because merging reduces competition. Okay, so cooperation among oligopolists is problematic because it's going to raise the price and lower the quantity, and since the quantity is lower, it's going to lower the efficiency, which means total surplus is going to fall. So there are laws which ban mergers, okay, a lot of times, or at least investigate them. Okay, so competition laws watch for mergers or trade practices that undermine social welfare. Social welfare is another name for total surplus or efficiency. One example of that is the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunication Commissions. So CRTC stands for that, and what they do is that they regulate the price of cell phones and TV. Okay, so they're sensitive about a bunch of things. One of them is price discrimination, which is what you've seen before. Price discrimination, if you remember, is trying to capture all of the willingness to pay of the people, applying different prices to different people. Another thing is deceptive marketing and false advertising. Another one would be price fixing or price maintenance. So sometimes what happens is that when you have two gas stations across the street, they could raise the price jointly, and if both of them raise the price, then people in that neighborhood pretty much have to pay the higher price. This is kind of a funny representation of that. If you have beggars, all of them asking for the same amount of spare change, which nobody carries, like 43 cents, right? Another one is bid rigging. So bid rigging is when you let the other bidder get the contract this time and then you get it next time. So this is about repeated games. Basically, the idea is that when you have two contractors competing to get a project, let's say from the government, they have to bid a certain price. Now, sometimes what happens is that they're like, okay, you know what, we're not going to compete with you, because if they compete with each other, then it's going to lower the price that is paid by the other side, or it's gonna lower the profit of each side. So they're like, you know what, you get it this time, we are gonna get it next time. So that's gonna unlock the problem there. Another thing competition laws are sensitive about is predatory pricing, and you might have heard of this. This is when an existing firm cuts its prices drastically to drive a new competitor out of business and restore its monopoly power. So here's the thing. Imagine a neighborhood where there has been a restaurant and then there's a new restaurant opening up, right? So the old restaurant is going to feel like, oh no, there's competition coming. So because usually once you've been in business for a long time, you tend to have lower costs than a new guy. So what you could do is you can lower your prices and drive out the other guy. Now, sometimes what happens is that they may cut their costs below their own costs, which means that they would incur a loss, and that's not realistic. Okay, so predatory pricing actually, for all practical purposes, it's not going to occur because it's very unlikely to fall below one's own cost and kind of sacrifice one's own profit for uncertain future gains. The future is speculative. Another firm can come in again when the price goes up, right? So there is a problem. A lot of times when they talk about predatory pricing, it's just an excuse. It's an excuse for something else, and we're going to talk about this. There is another practice which is problematic, and that's tying. So tying is when two products are sold together at a single price. Okay, so you might have seen, if you want to buy a fragrance, sometimes you get an offer basically, and the offer is that you don't just get the fragrance, but you also get the body lotion and aftershave. And you might be like, oh no, I don't want aftershave, you know, I'm a girl or whatever. But still, they kind of want to sell it all off, and they want to expand their market basically. A good example of that was Microsoft. So Microsoft was offering Windows, and Windows was pretty much a monopoly of Microsoft in the 90s. So this happened in 1998. Apple wasn't that big at the time. So what they did is that they bundled their Windows with Internet Explorer. Okay, there were some competitors in the web browser market, like Netscape. So Microsoft was using this in order to expand its monopoly to another market. So it had a monopoly in the operating system in the Windows market. It was trying to also have a monopoly more or less in the web browser system market. And the problem with this is that it's hard to decide where to draw the line. Okay, somewhat subjective. It makes sense to bundle two complements. So one of the arguments that Bill Gates and Microsoft provided was that if you buy a car, the car comes with stereos and comes with air conditioning. Now, stereos and air conditionings are other products, but the car seller also sells those, right? It doesn't let you go and get your own, right? I mean, you could change it later, but they actually sell it to you with the car. But it makes sense because they're complements, like stereos and cars, air conditioning and cars, those are complements, right? So Windows and web browser is also complements. So in a way, it makes sense to bundle a lot of times. But if they're totally irrelevant, then yeah, I mean, you don't want to bundle them. So pause here and take some notes. So here's a funny and crazy example of tying.
Do you sell toys?
We sell forbidden objects from places men fear to tread. We also sell frozen yogurt, which I call Frogut.
Well, I need something for my son's birthday.
Perhaps this will please the gentleman. Take this object, but beware, it carries a terrible curse.
Ooh, that's bad.
But it comes with a free Frogut.
That's good.
The Frogut is also cursed.
That's bad.
But you get your choice of topping.
That's good.
The toppings contain potassium benzoate. That's bad.
Oh no. So the argument for competition laws is that competition is good for us, but there are some practical problems with it. One of them is that they have simply proven ineffective so far, which means that there are some impediments. All right, regulatory bodies are captured by the very firms they're supposed to regulate, right? So this is a theory by George Stigler, who was a great economist and who won the Nobel Prize for it. Basically, the idea is that you realize that, oh, corporations own the government. They have a lot of influence over the government. And then you say, oh, you know what? The solution is to regulate them. And then you're like, okay, by who? Then by the government. So you're kind of getting into a vicious circle. There's a problem with that. There's incentive for lobbying. And lobbying, this is a term you have to know. Lobbying means mobilizing your resources to influence government policy. So whenever a company or a number of people or any organization wants to influence some law or policy in one way or another, that's lobbying done by interest groups. All right. A lot of times, so basically the idea is that here's the thing. The government is like, okay, let's regulate a certain industry, okay, so that they don't abuse their power. And you're like, well, okay, fine, let's do that. Who should decide the decisions, the technical decisions about this regulation? So the technical decisions should come with someone who has these skills. It's very likely to employ people from that very industry in order to give us those information that we need, right? That's why you can see that, you know, there's really a conflict of interest. So because they have very high stakes, and stakes means interests at risk, right? So again, this is also one of those terms that you want to know whenever you talk about stakes, so like stakeholder. So stakeholder means someone who has a lot of interests, and those interests are at risk. So basically there is this mutual relationship between big companies and the government, okay, both ways. So the government is like, you know what, we're not going to interfere with you, and then the big companies fund the government or the parties. Regulations are often abused to reduce competition. This is quite important. regulations are meant to improve competition, but a lot of times they're abused, okay? Under the pretext of unfair competition. This, like with Donald Trump, we see this all the time, right? So they come up with some form of pretext, some form of excuse that, oh, this is unfair competition, but in effect, it's only an excuse to reduce competition in the favor of a certain industry, like the steel industry. And that really defeats the purpose. Oligopolies aren't that bad, actually. Oligopolies compete more without government regulation. All right, so they are often a source of innovation. So one example of them would be Apple and Android. So those are oligopolies, those are big firms, or car companies, all refineries. All of these are big companies in small number who have a lot of market share, but they do tend to compete with each other and they do innovate. So in a way, they're not such a bad idea. All right, so here's the thing. This is a very important lesson. The problem with any government policy is that the ones making the decision are not the ones facing the consequences of those decisions. The ones making the decision are not the ones facing the consequence. So think of what kind of decisions are going to be made. Are they going to be efficient decisions, right? It's very likely to be less responsible decisions that they make. All right. The road to inefficiency is lack of accountability. You might want to write that down. The road to inefficiency is lack of accountability. So problems with government intervention. There are going to be grounds for arbitrary allocation, which would be based on bribe, lobbying, political or religious affiliation. If you don't know what this word lobbying means, go look it up because it's important. Basically, the idea is that with the government, what you have is you have a lot of power centralized in one place. And because of that, everybody will have some incentive to try to get a piece of that, right? And because you don't have markets, then who has to decide and based on what? Things become very subjective, things become very arbitrary, and things other than the efficiency requirement become relevant to the decision making, and those things may not necessarily be desirable. The government lacks required information for efficient allocation. How should the government know where is the best use of a certain resource? Okay, how should the government know about the real costs of doing something and the real benefits of doing something? Okay, so it's kind of like having a blindfold on. You say, oh no, what should I do? I'm so lost, right? That's pretty much what it is, right? So there's a real information problem. There's going to be rent seeking, which is a person or a firm's attempt to use the government's power to enhance their own economic well-being in ways that are not in the social interest. Okay, so this is where a person or a firm just goes after their own interest at the cost of the society and at the cost of others, right? Again, the idea is that you have this big, huge piece of pie in the hands of one sector called the government, and everybody would try to get a piece of that, right? So there is an incentive to bend it your own way. So examples of rent seeking, the way it works is that they would win a law in their own favor to have subsidies for them or to have price controls. You've seen price controls before, remember price ceiling and price floor, right? So sometimes those things come to limit competition. Or quotas. Quota basically means a share or a limit. Okay, so they put a quota on others so that others cannot compete with you. So all of these things are means of trying to have more power for one company or for one industry as opposed to others, or to pass favorable regulations. Sometimes these things work in the form of trade, right? So you want to bar out foreign competition, and you come up with some form of a quota or a tariff just so that you have a safe market for your own self. So there's a high cost of administration and there's no competition to force the costs down. So here's the thing, when you think of the government, remember, if markets are imperfect, then the government is also imperfect, right? The government also has its own failures. The government is also very costly with administration. What keeps the costs down is this idea of competition. If you feel that you have competitors who are going to drive you out of the business, then you're going to be very efficient and you're going to have the lowest cost possible. But the government doesn't have any competitors, right? So that's a problem, and that's why the costs of the government tend to be much higher than if the same thing were to be done by the private sector. If the government were to find the information that it has, first of all, it doesn't have a lot of information. Even if it were to make decisions, then how would they know? And that decision-making process is also very costly. All right, so this is the concept of a leaky bucket. So this is by an economist named Arthur Ocon, who came up with this idea that if you have, let's say you have a little town that doesn't have a water well, and there's a water well outside the town, and they decide to supply water from the well with a bucket, but their bucket is leaky. Right now, they could get some water to the town, but the idea is that some of the water is going to be lost in the way. The case of government intervention is always the case of a leaky bucket. Pause here. The case for a free market, the benefit of free market, one of them is that it decentralizes economic power. Right? So instead of having all of the power in the hands of one organization called the government, it's going to be decentralized. Okay, so it cannot be abused as much. It maximizes efficiency because the goods and services are produced at lowest cost and used where they're valued the most. So that's the idea of efficiency, maximizing the pie. Pursuit of profit in free market stimulates innovation. So you get innovation if there is more profit seeking by the private sector. So that's quite useful. And foreign competition restrains market power and abuse. So if you have one sector who tends to raise the prices too much, then the foreign competitors can come in and fight. That's why a lot of times domestic producers don't, they try to argue that foreign competition is bad. Foreign competition is bad for them only, but not for the whole society. The whole society benefits because the prices are going to be lower and you can save a lot. There's this cool concept of creative destruction by a brilliant economist called Joseph Schumpeter, where when a new firm attacks the monopolistic position and profits of another by developing new products, right? So if one firm is having a lot of profit in a certain industry, it gives incentives for other developers to come up with something new, and that's going to curtail the profits of the first thing, of the first company. This is actually good. So this is creative. This is useful because it limits the inefficiencies of market power. So market powers have many flaws and failures. We already saw that. There is no challenge, there is no argument there, but their problems can be mitigated with market mechanism itself, right? So the market provides us with the basic background, with the basic baseline to solve its own problems. External intervention only exacerbates the problem, okay? So the highest standard of living with minimum arbitrary advantages, which means minimum discrimination, can be achieved through the market process because of competition. Pause here. Let's look at some cool quotes. You don't need to write these down, but they're quite insightful. Arbitrary government power is being multiplied daily by the now practically unchallenged assumption that wherever there is any problem of any kind to be solved, government is the agency to step in and solve it. So we kind of take that for granted. This is by Henry Hazlitt, who was a brilliant economist and a libertarian. Another one is by John Adams. He was the second president of the US. Nip the shoots of arbitrary power in the bud is the only maxim which can ever preserve the liberties of any people. So if we are concerned with freedom, this is really the idea. Arbitrary power is the problem.